Hello, my name is Christopher Convery, and first and foremost, I would like to acknowledge that I reside on the traditional unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples, who have been stewards of this land for the time immemorial. This presentation is for PIDP 3300, facilitating learning with the adult brain in mind with Doug Major. I'm currently a term instructor in the hair design program at Vancouver Community College. And after this course, I will be closer to the conclusion of obtaining my PIDP. So with this presentation, I hope to explain how does the mind create bias in learning. I decided to research this topic with the help of Doug, as this is something that I experienced as an auxiliary instructor, filling in for various classes. Every so often, I may encounter resistance to the way of my instruction or delivery. And I would like to shed some light on what happens within our brain and how these biases arise. Furthermore, I will introduce some ways that can aid in curbing these biases in learning. So unconscious bias. Oftentimes, when we are learning something for the first time, we may bristle at a new idea or resist instruction. Self-admittedly, I struggle with my own learning within the PIDP. I find it challenging to stay on track, on task, and I generally complain to myself for a good portion of the time when I'm writing a paper or even when I'm creating this presentation. However, by the end of the course, I have gained new insight and information that I always find useful. So I guess, I have this initial feeling of dread, and it generally comes from the lack of my understanding of the topic at hand. Am I going to, figure things out? How do I navigate some of the software that we might be using? Is my writing up to par? All these kinds of things. I'm uncomfortable with this feeling, and I have to push through it or through this fear to complete what is needed. This is a result of our unconscious bias. According to Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity, unconscious biases are the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. Neurologists estimate our brains are exposed to 11 million pieces of information at one time, and our conscious brains can functionally deal with 40 of these pieces at a time. That leaves our unconscious selves to handle the other 99.9999996% that we can't get to. Dr. Steve Iacovelli states, our ancestors were all about safety. The same equals safe and different equals dangerous mentality is deep-rooted. It's a deep-rooted part of our wiring. The Smithsonian has an excellent online exhibition that explains the science of bias and how our brains rely on the shortcuts it creates and the harm that they can result in. Within this exhibition, it describes the three parts of the brains that make up the control panel for bias: the amygdala, the hippocampus, and the prefrontal cortex. The amygdala is the fear center of the brain. It generates many of our emotions, impulse reactions, and fears. This is the part of our brain that releases stress hormones, and when we feel stressed or afraid, it is responsible for our fight or flight response to a threat. An example of this from my classroom that comes to mind is during a lesson on Zoom, I randomly asked a student to present their findings on a topic. The student appeared stunned, nervously laughed, and suddenly turned off their camera. When I quickly messaged the student to see what happened, they apologized for the reaction, and they just said that they were just too frightened to speak publicly and just left. The hippocampus is a memory bank of our brain. This organ notes the associations that we make and reminds us of them later. It also plays an important role in the recall of emotional memories. In my students' case, their past negative experience when speaking publicly may have reemerged when I called on them. And finally, the prefrontal cortex is what we use to reason through different perspectives, weigh the pros and cons, or even revise previous assumptions. We use this part of our brain to calm ourselves, whereas the amygdala registers our fear, the hippocampus reminds us of why we are stressed, and the prefrontal cortex helps us settle things down. And with that, it tries to help refocus our stress into positive thoughts. Changing our biases is challenging because of how our brain uses heuristics to improve function. As stated by Dash and Thompson, our brains develop subconscious coping mechanisms that we can use to quickly make decisions. These subconscious mental shortcuts are called heuristics. They are the brain's way of automating repetitive tasks or decisions. Cognitive psychologist Herbert Simon introduced the concept of heuristics in the 1950s. The suggestion was made that while people strive to make rational choices, our judgment is subject to cognitive limitations. We are limited by the amount of time and the amount of information we have to make our choices. So it's almost like a cruise control. And this is where heuristics come into play. They allow us to make automatic responses to situations or decisions that we are familiar with. They play an important role in both our problem solving and decision making, as these mental shortcuts are often turned to allowing for quick solutions and reactions. Thompson states a few theories on why we rely on heuristics. The attribute substitution, where people substitute simpler but related questions in place of a more complex and difficult question. Effort reduction is where people use heuristics as a type of cognitive laziness to reduce the mental effort required to make decisions. And lastly, the fast and frugal theory as a use of heuristics that can be fast and correct in a certain context. However, if there is an exception in our decision-making process, our heuristics can fail. As an auxiliary instructor, I come into a classroom for a very short period. Students can be very resistant to my way of instruction, as they may be used to one method that their previous or their regular instructor shows them. Something that they've already learned, they might not want to try a different way. They may not realize that there are different methods to perform a practical skill taught in hairstyling, and they may struggle to accept a different way. This is a form of cognitive bias. Cognitive bias is a result of when these coping mechanisms or our heuristics fail us. Cognitive bias is a systematic error in thinking that occurs when people are processing and interpreting information in the world around them and affects the decisions and judgments that they make. The concept of cognitive bias was first introduced by researchers Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman in 1972. It is often a result of your brain's attempt to simplify information processing. A cognitive bias is rooted in thought processing errors, often arising from problems with memory, attention, attribution, and other mental mistakes. They can make us resistant to incorporating new information, resulting in learners remembering inaccurate information or even preventing learning from happening altogether. Another bias that can arise in learning is negative bias. This is actually something that I am struggling with while doing this presentation. A negative bias refers to the tendency of our brains to prioritize negative information over positive information, which can have significant effects on our decision-making processes and overall emotional state. So my negative bias is that I quite frankly haven't had to do post-secondary in 25 years, and I wasn't the best student growing up. And so going back into learning and having to take courses, I have a predetermined negative bias to studying, to doing homework, to time management. And it's something that I've had to try to overcome. Another negative bias, you can think about is when you hurt yourself as a child, you can probably recall something that's traumatic rather than positive. For instance, in grade 2, I broke my wrist going down a slide while standing up. I can still remember the whole event, and I can describe that specific part of the playground, but I could not tell you anything else about the other equipment or apparatuses in the park. According to the SEEDS model of biases, outlined in a Neuro Leadership Institute article by David Rock, negative bias is one of the 5 major types of cognitive biases that can affect our thinking and decision-making. The model suggests that our brains are wired to perceive potential threats and negative information as more important than positive information. And this is all due to evolutionary need to prioritize survival. So in my case, with PIDP or learning, subconsciously, my brain is trying to protect myself from the fear of failure. However, these biases can lead to a skewed perception of reality, and it has a tendency to make decisions based on fear or anxiety rather than rational thought. So in my case, I procrastinate. I don't want to do my homework. I don't want to do my research. And this is just something that is based on the fear of my failure as a student. But that's where how to overcome negative bias comes into play. In my classroom, I see a fear of failure constantly. Students attempting a task once or twice, then becoming frustrated, and then quitting. If I do return to a previously taught class that has been struggling with something, I always make a point to remind the students of the struggles that they had previously and the frustrations and their shortcomings. But I also want to highlight how far they've come since then, how much they've progressed and how much they've improved. In an article on positivepsychology.com, Courtney Ackerman suggests that a negativity bias can be overcome by practicing mindfulness, gratitude, and positive reframing. By becoming aware of our negative thoughts and emotions, challenging them, and focusing on the positive aspects of our lives, we can train our brains to see the world in a more balanced and optimistic way. Overall, understanding and addressing negative bias can be a powerful tool for improving our decision-making abilities, emotional well-being, and overall quality of life. So one strategy to work with cognitive bias in our brains is to practice metacognition, or thinking about our thinking. This involves reflecting on how our own biases and assumptions may be influencing our thoughts, perceptions, and actions. In an article from Inside Higher Ed, author Joshua Kim suggests several strategies for practicing metacognition, including seeking out diverse perspectives, exposing yourself to a variety of viewpoints and sources of information that challenge your assumptions and beliefs, challenging your own thinking, asking yourself critical questions about how your own thought process is and how to consider alternative explanations and perspectives, seeking feedback, asking for feedback from others on your ideas and perspectives, and to gain insight on your own biases and assumptions. In addition to this, there's another article from The Guardian, and author Bradley Bush suggests several strategies for combating cognitive bias, including developing a growth mindset, which is adopting a mindset that focuses on learning from mistakes and seeking out challenges that can help counteract that fixed mindset that can lead to confirmation bias. So, always trying to be a little more curious and try to explore different avenues of learning. Encouraging critical thinking. Encouraging our students to question their assumptions, consider alternative perspectives, and also evaluate the evidence that supports these new findings. And once again, using that megacognitive strategies, teaching our students to reflect on their own thinking, recognize their own biases like I have, and to seek out feedback to improve their learning. By practicing metacognition and encouraging critical thinking, we can become more aware of our own cognitive biases, and we can also work to overcome them. On this last page here is my references for this presentation. I'll also place it in Moodle, along with some annotated remarks on each reference. Thank you very much for watching, and hopefully you've learned a little bit. Thank you.